My name is Joyce, and I'm 31 years old. As I packed up my desk on that final Friday afternoon, my fingers lingered over the small USB drive that nobody knew existed. 3 years of building Pinnacle Logistics International from the ground up, and they were replacing me with a 22-year-old fresh graduate whose only qualification was sharing the CEO's last name. They thought they were so clever, so strategic. Before I share what happened next, I'm curious where you're watching from. If you've ever been unfairly pushed out of a job you loved, hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories of workplace justice. Let me take you back to when it all began. 3 years ago, I walked into Pinnacle Logistics International for my first day as an operations coordinator. The company was already established, handling about $15 million in annual revenue, but their systems were outdated and their client relationships were purely transactional. I saw opportunity everywhere I looked. My background wasn't typical for logistics. I'd studied international business and spent 2 years teaching English in Seoul, where I'd picked up conversational Korean and developed a deep appreciation for Asian business culture. When I returned to Chicago, I knew I wanted to work in international trade, and Pinnacle seemed like the perfect place to start. Harold Brennan, the CEO, conducted my final interview himself. He was in his late 50s, then silver-haired and sharp-eyed, the kind of executive who built his company from nothing and took pride in knowing every detail of the operation. During that interview, he'd been impressed by my language skills and my fresh perspective on supply chain optimization. "You know what I like about you, Joyce?" he'd said, leaning back in his leather chair. "You don't think like a typical logistics person. You think like a problem solver." Those first months, I threw myself into learning every aspect of the business. I spent extra hours in the warehouse with Tom, our warehouse manager, understanding how shipments actually moved through our facility. Tom was a veteran, 20 years in logistics, and he taught me things no business school could. How to spot potential delays before they happened, which carriers were reliable during peak season, how to read between the lines when customs officers asked questions. I worked closely with Mark from IT to understand our tracking systems. The software we used was functional but clunky, requiring multiple manual entries for each shipment. Mark and I started brainstorming ways to automate the process, sketching out flowcharts on whiteboards during lunch breaks. Sandra from accounting became my unofficial mentor. She'd been with the company for 7 years and knew where all the bodies were buried, so to speak. Over coffee, she'd share insights about which clients paid on time, which ones always disputed charges, and which ones were worth the extra effort. But my real breakthrough came when I started working directly with our international clients. We had a handful of Japanese companies using our services, but communication was always filtered through interpreters or handled in broken English. One day, Yamamoto Corporation called with an urgent issue. Their regular contact was out sick, and they were frustrated, ready to pull their contract. I picked up the phone and greeted them in Japanese. The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Then Mr. Yamamoto himself came on the line speaking rapid Japanese, explaining their problem. A shipment of precision electronics components was stuck in customs, and their production line would shut down without them. I spent the next 14 hours solving that problem. I called customs, directly filled out emergency paperwork, coordinated with our carriers for expedited delivery, and even arranged for our own truck to make the final delivery when the carrier couldn't guarantee their timeline. By morning, Yamamoto Corporation had their components. Mr. Yamamoto called Harold personally to praise my work. That single save had prevented $1 million production delay. Harold called me into his office that afternoon. "Joyce, what you did yesterday was exceptional. I'm promoting you to Senior Operations Coordinator, effective immediately. Keep this up and you'll be running this place someday." The promotion came with a substantial raise and more responsibility. I was now handling all our Asian accounts, and I threw myself into expanding them. I started learning basic Japanese using language apps during my commute and practicing with native speakers online. Within 6 months, I could hold business conversations comfortably. Our Korean clients were equally impressed when I could discuss shipment details in their language. One client, Samsung's subsidiary division, had been considering dropping us for a larger competitor. After 3 video calls where I presented entirely in Korean, discussing not just logistics, but understanding their corporate culture and requirements, they signed a 5-year contract worth $12 million annually. The real game changer came when the previous operations manager announced his retirement. Robert had been with the company since its founding, and his departure left a massive knowledge gap. Harold offered me the position of senior operations manager, making me the youngest person to hold that role in the company's history. Robert's leaving us his files and contact lists. Harold had said. But the real relationships, those die with transition unless someone can maintain them. I believe you can. What Harold didn't mention was that Robert had been old school, keeping most critical information in his head or in personal files. The official handover was minimal. Contact lists with names and numbers, but no context. Shipping routes with no explanation of why certain carriers were preferred. Pricing structures that seemed random without understanding the relationships behind them. I spent 3 months rebuilding our entire operational database from scratch. I called every client personally, reintroduced myself, and learned their specific needs. I discovered that many of our most profitable relationships were built on handshake deals Robert had made years ago, completely undocumented. The Yamamoto Corporation account, for instance, was worth far more than the standard contract suggested. Robert had been giving them priority handling and special rates in exchange for referrals that had brought in 5 other Japanese companies. Without documentation, this could have been lost. So I created my own system. Every client got a detailed profile including not just their shipping needs, but their corporate culture. Key decision makers, preferred communication styles, even notes about their fiscal years and busy seasons. I built relationships with their assistants and middle managers, the people who actually manage day-to-day logistics. When COVID hit in my second year, these relationships became critical. The world's supply chains were in chaos, ports were backed up, and containers were scarce. Larger logistics companies were dropping smaller clients to focus on their biggest accounts. We did the opposite. I personally called every client to assess their needs. For Yamamoto Corporation, whose just-in-time manufacturing model meant they couldn't afford delays, I found creative solutions. When traditional shipping routes were clogged, I coordinated with Mark to develop a tracking system that could monitor multiple alternative routes simultaneously. We started routing their shipments through smaller ports using combination transport methods that were more expensive but reliable. I negotiated with carriers during off hours, sometimes calling partners in Asia at 2 a.m. Chicago time to secure space on vessels. The tracking system I developed with Mark became our secret weapon. While other companies were giving vague delivery windows of weeks, we could tell clients within 48 hours when their shipment would arrive. The system pulled data from multiple sources, used predictive algorithms to identify potential delays, and automatically suggested alternative routes. Harold was ecstatic with the results. While our competitors lost clients during COVID, we actually grew by 30%. At the company Christmas party that year, he pulled me aside. "Joyce, you saved this company. That tracking system alone is worth millions. Next year, when things stabilize, we're going to talk about making you a partner in this business." The first warning sign appeared in October of 2023, though I didn't recognize it at the time. Harold called me into his office on a Monday morning, unusual because our regular meetings were Thursday afternoons. "Joyce, I've been thinking about succession planning." He started settling into his chair with his coffee. "You know I'm not getting any younger, and the board has been asking about documentation of our processes." It seemed reasonable. Harold was 61, and while he showed no signs of slowing down, succession planning was smart business. I nodded, already mentally organizing the project. "I want you to create comprehensive documentation for everything you do," he continued. "Every client relationship, every system you've built, every process you've optimized. Think of it as creating a handbook for the future of this company." "Asien." The request made sense, but the timeline seemed aggressive. He wanted everything documented within 6 weeks. I pushed back gently. "Harold, that's 3 years of development you're asking me to document. Some of these client relationships are incredibly nuanced. Mr. Yamamoto, for instance, does business based on trust that took years to build. You can't just hand that over to someone new." Harold waved his hand dismissively. "Of course not. This is just for continuity planning. Insurance, really. What if you got hit by a bus tomorrow? The company needs to be protected." The bus comment felt oddly specific, but I laughed it off. I started working on the documentation, staying late to write detailed procedures while still managing daily operations. Mark noticed my extended hours and brought me coffee one evening. "Since when does Harold care about documentation?" he asked, sitting on the edge of my desk. "The man once told me real business happens in handshakes, not paperwork." "People change," I said, though Mark's observation nagged at me. Maybe the board really is pushing for it. 2 weeks into the documentation project, Harold introduced his nephew to the office. Dylan Brennan walked in on a Tuesday morning, 22 years old, fresh from graduating Boston University, with a business degree his uncle had undoubtedly paid for. "Everyone, I want you to meet Dylan," Harold announced at our morning meeting. He's joining us as an operations intern to learn the business from the ground up. Dylan stood next to his uncle, and the family resemblance was obvious. Same strong jaw, same confident stance. But where Harold's confidence came from, building something from nothing, Dylan seemed to come from never having been told no. "I'm excited to learn from all of you," Dylan said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Especially you, Joyce. Uncle Harold says you're the best in the business." The compliment felt hollow, delivered with the practiced ease of someone who'd been taught what to say but not how to mean it. I smiled back professionally and welcomed him to the team. Harold assigned Dylan to shadow me, which meant disrupting my carefully organized days to explain basic concepts to someone who showed up late and left early. His first day shadowing me, he arrived 45 minutes late with Starbucks no apology, just a casual, "Traffic was insane," as if Chicago traffic was somehow unexpected. I started with the basics, showing him our tracking system. Dylan pulled out his phone halfway through my explanation texting while I talked about customs documentation. When I stopped talking, he looked up. "Sorry, what? This seems pretty straightforward. I mean, it's just shipping stuff, right?" The dismissiveness in his tone made my jaw clench, but I kept my voice even. International logistics is actually quite complex. For instance, each country has different customs requirements, and a single error can delay shipments for weeks. "Can't the computer handle all that?" he asked, already looking bored. I spent the rest of that week trying to teach Dylan, but he had no interest in learning. He showed up when he felt like it, usually late, always with an excuse. When he did engage, he questioned everything, not from curiosity but from arrogance, suggesting improvements that showed he didn't understand the basics. The breaking point came during a client call with Yamamoto Corporation. I'd been preparing Dylan for this call for days, explaining the importance of respect in Japanese business culture, the need for precision in communication, and the critical nature of this quarterly review. Dylan joined the video call 5 minutes late, eating a sandwich. Mr. Yamamoto's expression flickered with disapproval. Throughout the call, Dylan interrupted me twice to suggest modernizing processes that were specifically designed to meet Yamamoto's preferences. He mispronounced Yamamoto's name 3 different ways and ended the call by saying, "Later, guys," before abruptly leaving the video. I spent an hour on the phone with Mr. Yamamoto afterward, apologizing and assuring him that Dylan was just an intern, not a decision maker. Mr. Yamamoto was gracious, but concerned. "Joyce-san, this young man, he is family to Harold's son," he asked carefully. "He is," I admitted. "I see," Mr. Yamamoto said, and in those 2 words I heard volumes of concern. The next day, I addressed the situation with Harold. I kept my feedback professional, focusing on Dylan's impact on client relationships rather than personal criticisms. Harold's response shocked me. "Joyce, you need to be more patient with Dylan. He's young, yes, but he has fresh ideas. Sometimes I think you're too set in your ways, too protective of how things have always been done. Too set in my ways, I'd revolutionized our operations, built systems from nothing, saved the company during a global pandemic. And now I was too set in my ways. I left that meeting feeling like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. Over the next weeks, I noticed changes. Dylan was added to email chains he had no business being on. He started attending strategic planning meetings where interns had never been welcome. His LinkedIn profile updated to show his title as Operations Manager, even though he was supposedly an intern. Sandra pulled me aside one afternoon, her expression worried. "Joyce, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I process payroll. Dylan's not being paid as an intern. He's got a manager's salary higher than some people who've been here 5 years." The pieces started falling into place, but I still didn't want to believe it. Harold had promised me partnership, had praised my work, had said I saved the company. Surely he wouldn't replace me with his unqualified nephew. But then came the email about restructuring, a vague corporate speak message about optimizing operations for future growth and aligning resources with strategic objectives. Mark forwarded it to me with a single line, "This doesn't smell right." By December, the situation had deteriorated beyond recognition. Dylan no longer pretended to be learning from me. Instead, he actively undermined my decisions and meetings. The pattern was always the same. I'd present a carefully researched recommendation, and Dylan would immediately counter with something that sounded innovative, but was actually reckless or uninformed. During a critical meeting about expanding our West Coast operations, I presented a phased approach based on careful market analysis and our current capacity. Dylan interrupted halfway through. "I think Joyce is overthinking this," he said, looking directly at his uncle. "Why don't we just acquire a smaller company out there? Fast-track the whole thing." "Which company?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Have you researched potential acquisitions, checked their client compatibility, verified their financial health? Dylan shrugged. Details. We can figure that out after we decide to move forward. Harold nodded thoughtfully. Dylan raises an interesting point, Joyce. Sometimes you do get caught up in analysis paralysis. Analysis paralysis. I'd grown our revenue by 40% through careful planning. Every expansion I'd recommended had succeeded precisely because I'd done the research. But I could see Harold's eyes had already shifted, seeing his nephew as the future and me as the past. The Samsung situation became the weapon they'd use against me. Dylan had insisted on personally handling a $30 million contract renewal with Samsung's subsidiary. Despite my protests, Harold gave him full authority over the negotiation. Dylan approached it like a used car salesman, all aggressive tactics and pressure moves. He ignored every cultural consideration I'd documented, treating the Korean executives like they were naive, rather than sophisticated business partners who valued relationship and respect over flashy presentations. During the final negotiation call, Dylan actually told the Samsung team they'd be stupid to go with a competitor, that we were doing them a favor by even offering renewal at these rates. I watched the Samsung executives' faces turn cold, their polite smiles becoming masks of professional courtesy that meant the relationship was over. When Samsung requested a 48-hour delay to consider the offer, Dylan celebrated like he'd won. See, they need time to figure out how to say yes to such a great deal. I knew better. In Korean business culture, that delay meant they were finding a polite way to say no. I tried explaining this to Harold, but he brushed off my concerns. Joyce, you're being too pessimistic. Dylan's approach is exactly what this company needs. Fresh energy, bold moves. 48 hours later, Samsung declined to renew. $30 million gone. The email was polite but firm, thanking us for 3 years of partnership, but indicating they were moving in a different direction. Harold called an emergency meeting. Dylan sat at the table, somehow managing to look both defensive and arrogant. I had all the documentation from the negotiation ready to show exactly where things went wrong. But Harold didn't want to hear it. Joyce, you were supposed to be mentoring Dylan through this process. How did you let this happen? I stared at him in disbelief. Harold, I specifically recommended against letting Dylan lead this negotiation. I have the emails where I outlined the risks. Emails aren't leadership, Joyce. You should have done more to ensure success. Dylan smirked from across the table, and I realized this had been the plan all along. Let Dylan fail, blame me, create justification for what was coming next. I worked 18-hour days trying to salvage other accounts that Dylan had touched. The Yamamoto Corporation was nervous. 3 Korean clients were requesting meetings to reassess our partnership, and even our domestic clients were noticing the chaos. Tom came to my office one evening as I was reviewing damage control plans. Joyce, I've been here 15 years, he said, closing the door behind him. I've seen Harold make some questionable calls, but this thing with his nephew, this is different. He's going to destroy everything you built. He's certainly trying, I said, exhaustion making me more honest than usual. No, Tom said, shaking his head. I mean Harold. He's going to destroy it all just to give that kid your job. Mark heard him on a call with the board saying you're resistant to change, stuck in old patterns. He's setting you up. The final insult came when I submitted my annual review self-assessment, something I'd always taken seriously. I documented every success, every innovation, every crisis averted. The response came back within an hour, clearly not enough time for anyone to have actually read it. Meets expectations. 3 years of exceeding every metric, saving the company during a pandemic, building systems that revolutionized our operations, and I met expectations. Meanwhile, Dylan was being sent to Singapore for a 2-week executive training program, at a cost of $20,000, not including the first-class flights and 5-star hotel Harold had approved. Mark found me in the break room the day Dylan left for Singapore, staring at my coffee like it might have answers. You know it's over, right? He said gently. Whatever Harold promised you, whatever you thought you were building here, it's done. I know, I admitted. I just can't believe he'd throw away everything for nepotism. Mark laughed bitterly. You can't. Joyce, this is corporate America. Merit's just a word they use in mission statements. When push comes to shove, it's always about who you know, not what you know. I wanted to argue, but the evidence was overwhelming. Every client relationship I'd built was being handed to Dylan. Every system I'd created was being credited to operational improvements, with no mention of my name. Even the tracking system I'd developed with Mark was now being called the Brennan Logistics Innovation Platform. The Thursday before everything ended, I did something I'd never done in 3 years at Pinnacle. I called in sick, not because I was ill, but because I needed to think. I sat in my apartment looking at the USB drive that contained the real database, the one I'd built on my own time, with my own tools, containing all the relationship notes and personal connections that made our Asian operations work. Technically, it wasn't company property. I'd developed it independently, never transferred it to company servers, and maintained it on my personal equipment. The employment contract I'd signed said nothing about intellectual property I created on my own time with my own resources. Harold had been too cheap to pay for proper legal documentation back then, a fact that was about to become very important. Friday afternoon, 3 o'clock. I was typing up a transition report when Linda from HR knocked on my door. Her face was carefully neutral, the expression of someone about to do something unpleasant but necessary. "Joyce, could you join us in conference room A, please?" The walk to the conference room felt endless and instant simultaneously. I knew what was coming, had known for weeks really, but knowing didn't make it easier. Harold sat at the head of the table, avoiding eye contact. Linda had papers spread in front of her. The scene was so cliché it would have been funny if it weren't happening to me. "Joyce, please sit," Harold said, finally looking at me, with an expression that was meant to seem sympathetic, but just looked guilty. "I want to start by saying how much we've appreciated your contributions to Pinnacle." The past tense told me everything. I sat down, placed my hands flat on the table, and waited. Harold shifted uncomfortably at my silence. "As you know, the logistics industry is evolving rapidly," he continued, reading from what were clearly prepared notes. "We need to position ourselves for future growth, and that requires a new strategic direction." "A new strategic direction," I repeated flatly. "Is that what we're calling it?" Linda jumped in, her HR training kicking in. "Joyce, the company is restructuring the operations department to better align with our 5-year plan. Unfortunately, your position is being eliminated." "Eliminated," I said. "And I suppose Dylan's position as operations manager, the one he's been listing on LinkedIn for weeks, is part of this new structure." Harold's face flushed. "Dylan's role is different. He brings fresh perspectives that align with our digital transformation initiatives." I almost laughed. Dylan couldn't even figure out how to run a customs report without help, but sure, he was going to lead a digital transformation. Linda pushed papers across the table. "We're offering a severance package of 2 weeks pay continuation of health benefits through the end of the month and a neutral reference. In exchange, we need you to sign the separation agreement and NDA." I picked up the agreement, scanning it quickly. It was insultingly basic, clearly a template Linda had pulled offline. The NDA section was particularly amusing, trying to claim ownership of everything I'd ever thought while employed by Pinnacle. 2 weeks, I said. "After 3 years of building your entire Asian operations network, saving the company during COVID, and creating systems that increased efficiency by 40%. 2 weeks. "It's standard," Linda said weakly. "Standard," I echoed. "Like replacing your most experienced operations manager with someone who can't even spell Yamamoto correctly." Harold's jaw clenched. "Joyce, I'd hoped we could do this professionally." "Professionally? You mean like how Dylan professionally insulted our biggest clients? Or how he professionally lost us a $30 million contract?" "That's enough," Harold said, his mask finally slipping. "The decision is made. Dylan will be taking over operations starting Monday. We need all company property returned immediately. Laptop, phone, keycard, and all passwords and documentation." I pulled out my company laptop and phone, placing them on the table. The keycard followed. Linda had a checklist marking off items as I returned them. "We'll need all passwords and access codes," Linda said, pushing another form toward me. I filled it out carefully, listing every company system I had access to. The official email, the corporate tracking system, the vendor portals. Everything they knew about. I didn't mention the USB drive in my purse, the one with the real database. I didn't mention that the tracking system's core algorithm was linked to my personal GitHub account. I didn't mention that 15 of our biggest Asian clients had my personal WhatsApp and only communicated through that channel. "Is that everything?" Linda asked. "Everything that belongs to the company?" I said truthfully. Harold leaned forward. "Joyce, I want you to know this isn't personal. Dylan has an MBA, fresh training in modern logistics methods. The company needs to evolve." "An MBA?" I said, standing up. Well, that certainly trumps actual experience and proven results. I'm sure Mr. Yamamoto will be impressed. I signed the separation agreement, noting with amusement that it only covered company property and information, not personal relationships or independently developed tools. Harold's cheapness in not hiring proper lawyers 3 years ago meant the contract had more holes than Swiss cheese. We'll need you to leave immediately, Linda said apologetically. Security will escort you to clean out your desk. The security escort was Ray, who I'd known for 2 years. He looked embarrassed as he walked me to my office. "This is messed up, Joyce," he said quietly. "Everyone knows it." I packed my personal items quickly. Photos, my coffee mug, a few books. I left all the company materials, the binders full of processes I'd documented at Harold's request. Let Dylan figure it out from those. Good luck. Understanding why we route Yamamoto's shipments through specific ports on specific days without knowing about their production schedules. As I walked out, I passed Mark's office. He stood in the doorway, gave me a small nod. Sandra was by the reception desk, tears in her eyes. Tom was in the warehouse entrance, arms crossed, looking furious. I stopped at the main entrance, turned back to look at the office I'd spent 3 years building into something special. Harold stood at his window watching me leave. Dylan would return from Singapore on Sunday, ready to take over my job on Monday. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd successfully pushed me out, replaced experience with nepotism, traded competence for connections. They had no idea what they'd actually done. The USB drive in my purse felt warm against my hip. 3 years of relationships, personal cell numbers, WhatsApp contacts, preferred communication times, family details that turned business transactions into friendships. Mr. Yamamoto's direct line that he only gave to people he trusted. The Korean clients who did business with me, not Pinnacle. The tracking algorithm that would stop working in 72 hours when my personal API key expired. Harold had gotten the documentation he'd asked for every process spelled out in detail. But processes without relationships are just words on paper. You can document how to bow properly to a Japanese executive, but you can't document the trust built over hundreds of interactions. You can write down that Mr. Park from Samsung prefers morning calls, but you can't transfer the respect earned by remembering his daughter's graduation. I sat in my car for a moment, phone already buzzing with messages. 3 clients had somehow already heard about my departure. News travels fast in the logistics world. I turned off the phone. They could wait until Monday. Dylan wanted my job so badly he could have it. All of it. Every crisis, every midnight call, every impossible demand. Everything except what actually made it work. The weekend passed in a blur of strategic planning. I wasn't vindictive by nature, but I also wasn't going to make Dylan's transition easy. They'd pushed me out after I'd given everything to that company, and now they expected me to just disappear quietly. Saturday morning, I backed up everything on the USB drive to multiple secure cloud locations. The database I'd built wasn't just contact information. It was a complex web of relationships, preferences, and personal notes that made our Asian operations function. Without it, Dylan had names and numbers, but no context. Like having a phone book for a city where you don't speak the language. I turned my personal phone back on Saturday afternoon. 23 missed calls, 47 WhatsApp messages, and enough emails to crash a server. Most were from clients, but a few were from competitors who'd somehow already heard about my departure. Sunday evening, as Dylan was presumably flying back from Singapore, I got a call from an unknown number. Normally, I'd ignore it, but something made me answer. "Ms. Joyce, this is David Chen from Pacific Crown Logistics." Pacific Crown was our biggest competitor, 3 times Pinnacle's size, with offices across Asia. David Chen was their Executive Vice President of Operations. "Mr. Chen, how can I help you? I heard through the grapevine that you might be available. I'd like to discuss an opportunity that could be mutually beneficial." We talked for an hour. By the end of the call, I had an interview scheduled for Tuesday. Pacific Crown was looking to expand their boutique services division, focusing on high-touch client relationships rather than volume. It was exactly what I'd tried to build at Pinnacle before Dylan had destroyed it. Monday morning came faster than expected. At 9 a.m. sharp, I knew Dylan would be walking into my former office, sitting at my former desk, probably posting about his promotion on social media. By 9:30, my phone started ringing. The first call was from Mr. Yamamoto himself, not his assistant or operations manager, but the CEO of Yamamoto Corporation. He was confused and concerned. He'd tried to reach me at my Pinnacle email about an urgent shipment issue, only to receive an auto reply saying I was no longer with the company. Joyce-san, forgive my directness, but what is happening? We have 3 containers of semiconductor equipment arriving Wednesday, and the new person, this Dylan, he does not understand our requirements. I explained my departure professionally, without bad-mouthing Pinnacle or Harold. Mr. Yamamoto was silent for a long moment. This is most unfortunate. You understand our business, our culture. This Dylan person... He paused, choosing words carefully. He lacks wisdom. I'm sure he'll learn quickly. I said diplomatically, knowing full well Dylan wouldn't last a week with Yamamoto's standards. Joyce-san, if you join another company, would you please inform me Yamamoto Corporation values relationships over conveniences? The second call was from Jennifer Park at Samsung's subsidiary. She was less diplomatic than Mr. Yamamoto. Joyce, what do you mean you're gone? We have a massive shipment coming through and Dylan just asked me to email him the details or whatever. Does he think we're some mum and pop shop? By noon, 5 more clients had called my personal number. Each had tried to work with Dylan, and each had been met with incompetence wrapped in arrogance. He'd told one client to just Google it when asked about customs requirements. He'd hung up on another when they called outside of regular business hours, not understanding that international logistics doesn't follow Chicago time. Tuesday's interview with Pacific Crown went better than expected. David Chen had done his homework, knowing about every major client relationship I'd built, every innovation I'd implemented. We're not looking for someone to just manage operations, he said. We're looking for someone to build something special. Your reputation in the Asian logistics community is impressive. Mr. Yamamoto speaks very highly of you. You know, Mr. Yamamoto, David smiled. The logistics world is smaller than people think. When he heard you might be available, he called me personally to recommend you. That kind of endorsement is worth more than any resume. By Wednesday, things at Pinnacle had deteriorated into chaos. Mark called me during lunch, speaking quietly. Joyce, it's a disaster. Dylan can't access the tracking system because your API key expired. He doesn't understand why the Korean clients won't return his calls. 3 shipments are stuck in customs because he filed the wrong paperwork. Harold's been screaming all morning. That's unfortunate, I said neutrally. Unfortunate Joyce, Tom's about to quit. Sandra's looking for other jobs. The whole place is falling apart. Thursday afternoon, Harold called me personally. His voice was tight with barely controlled panic. Joyce, we need your help with the transition. Some of the systems aren't working properly. I'm sorry to hear that, I said pleasantly. I left detailed documentation as requested. The documentation doesn't explain everything. The tracking system stopped working. The clients won't talk to Dylan. We need you to come in and fix this. I'm no longer an employee of Pinnacle Harold. If you need consulting services, my rate is $500 per hour, 40-hour minimum paid in advance. $500. That's extortion. That's market rate for emergency logistics consulting. Of course you could have Dylan figure it out. He has an MBA after all. Harold hung up on me. Friday morning, Pacific Crown called with an offer. The salary was double what Pinnacle had paid, plus signing bonus plus partnership track within 2 years. They also agreed to my condition that I could bring over any clients who chose to follow me with appropriate non-compete considerations. I accepted immediately. That afternoon, I received a legal threat from Pinnacle's lawyer demanding I return all company property and cease interfering with their operations. I forwarded it to my own lawyer, who laughed when he read it. They're claiming you stole their database, the one you built on your personal time with your personal resources, and they want you to fix systems you don't have access to. This is desperation disguised as legal action. My response was simple. I hadn't taken any company property. The relationships I'd built were personal. The tracking system had been linked to my personal accounts, which I was under no obligation to maintain after termination. As for the clients, I hadn't contacted a single one about moving to Pacific Crown. They'd called me. Within 3 months, the transformation was complete. What had started as Harold's plan to give his nephew my job had turned into the systematic destruction of everything he'd built over decades. Pacific Crown gave me carte blanche to build my division. I brought in Mark as our head of IT, offering him 50% more than Pinnacle paid. Sandra joined as our financial controller, finally getting the respect she deserved. Tom took some convincing, but when I offered him the chance to redesign our warehouse operations from scratch, he couldn't resist. But the real victory was the clients. Yamamoto Corporation was the first to formally switch, bringing their $20 million annual contract to Pacific Crown. Mr. Yamamoto told me later that Dylan had actually suggested they should feel grateful for Pinnacle's services during a call fundamentally misunderstanding the partnership nature of Japanese business relationships. The Korean clients followed within weeks. Jennifer from Samsung's subsidiary didn't even try to be diplomatic about it. Dylan told me that our requirements were too complicated and we should simplify them. He actually said we were making things harder than necessary. Does he understand we're paying him to handle complexity? Each client who switched told similar stories. Dylan's arrogance, his inability to understand cultural nuances, his refusal to accommodate time zones or urgent requests. He treated logistics like it was a simple transaction instead of a relationship-based service. By month 2, Pinnacle had lost 40% of their revenue. The board called an emergency meeting. Harold tried to blame market conditions, competitive pressure, anything but the truth. But when someone leaked that his nephew had replaced an experienced manager just weeks before the exodus began, the connection was obvious. The death blow came when Dylan made a critical error with a pharmaceutical shipment, failing to maintain cold chain documentation. The client not only pulled their contract, but filed a formal complaint with regulatory bodies. The investigation revealed multiple documentation failures under Dylan's management, all traceable to his first weeks in the position. Harold was forced to hire 3 people to replace me: an operations manager, a client relationship specialist, and an Asian markets coordinator. Combined, their salaries were 4 times what he'd been paying me. Even then, they couldn't replicate what I'd built because they were starting from scratch with damaged relationships. Dylan was quietly reassigned to business development, a made-up position with no actual responsibilities. He still posted on LinkedIn about being an operations executive at Pinnacle Logistics. But everyone in the industry knew the truth. He'd been given everything and had managed to destroy it in record time. 6 months after my departure, I got a call from Harold. His voice was different, older, somehow defeated. "Joyce, I wanted to apologize." I stayed silent, letting him continue. "I made a terrible mistake. I let family pressure cloud my judgment. The board is forcing me into early retirement. Stock price is down 35%. We're considering a merger just to survive." "I'm sorry to hear that, Harold." And I was partially. The Harold who'd hired me, who'd recognized potential and rewarded merit, that man I respected. The Harold who'd thrown it all away for nepotism, him I felt nothing for. "Dylan's leaving the company," he continued, "moving to Florida to explore other opportunities. His parents blame me for not setting him up better. The irony was painful. He'd destroyed a successful company to set up his nephew, only to have it blow up so spectacularly that even his family blamed him. "Joyce, the board wants to know if you'd consider coming back. They're willing to offer significant equity, full control of operations, whatever it takes." "Harold, I appreciate the offer, but I'm very happy at Pacific Crown. We're actually expanding our operations, looking to acquire strategic assets in the logistics space." There was a long pause. "You're looking to acquire... Joyce, are you saying what I think you're saying?" Pacific Crown had indeed authorized me to explore acquiring Pinnacle's Asian operations division, the one I'd built, the one Dylan had destroyed. We could buy it for pennies on the dollar, fold it into our operations, and restore the client relationships. I'm saying that if Pinnacle is looking to divest certain assets, Pacific Crown might be interested in discussing it. The call ended with Harold promising to bring it to the board. 3 weeks later, we acquired Pinnacle's entire Asian operations for a fraction of its former value. I insisted on one condition in the acquisition agreement: Dylan Brennan was permanently barred from any role in the combined operations. Now, a year later, I sit in my corner office at Pacific Crown, looking out over the Chicago skyline. The USB drive that started this journey sits in my desk drawer, no longer needed, but kept as a reminder. The acquisition of Pinnacle's operations was completed 6 months ago. We retained the good employees, the ones who'd been loyal to the work rather than the nepotism. The rest found their own way out when they realized merit actually mattered again. Harold retired to Arizona, his reputation in tatters. The logistics community is small and everyone knows what happened. He went from respected founder to cautionary tale, the man who destroyed his company for nepotism. Dylan moved to Florida as planned, but his LinkedIn updates tell a different story than he probably intended. Consultant at a company that doesn't seem to exist. Entrepreneur with no actual business. His last post was about the importance of family supporting each other, the irony completely lost on him. The clients thrived under proper management. Yamamoto Corporation expanded their contract by 50%. Samsung's subsidiary brought over 2 sister companies. Our Asian operations division, the one I built from nothing, twice destroyed, and rebuilt again, now generates over $100 million annually. But the real satisfaction comes from the people who stood by me. Mark is now Chief Technology Officer of our division, building systems that make our competitors look antiquated. Sandra runs finance for the entire Asian operations, finally getting the recognition she deserved. Tom revolutionized our warehouse operations, winning an Industry Innovation Award. We've also made it a point to mentor young professionals, especially women in logistics. I run a quarterly workshop for operations managers, teaching them not just the technical aspects, but the relationship building that makes international logistics work. I tell them about the importance of documentation, but more importantly, about building value that can't be easily replaced. Last week, I got an unexpected message from Jennifer at Samsung. She'd heard through the grapevine that Dylan had applied for a position at one of their vendors. Her message was short. Warned them. They said thanks for the heads up. The logistics world has a long memory. I think about Joyce from 3 years ago, walking into Pinnacle, excited about possibilities, eager to prove herself. She built something amazing, had it stolen from her, and then built something even better. The pain of that betrayal has faded, replaced by gratitude for where it led. Sometimes being pushed out of your comfort zone isn't punishment. It's liberation. Sometimes losing what you thought you wanted opens the door to what you actually deserve. That USB drive in my drawer, I keep it as a reminder that your true value isn't in the title they give you or the desk you sit at. It's in the irreplaceable expertise you build when nobody's watching, the relationships you nurture, when it would be easier, not to the systems you create that nobody else understands. They thought they were so clever, replacing experience with entitlement, merit with nepotism. They had no idea that when you fire someone who holds the keys, you better make sure you know what doors those keys open. Harold learned that lesson too late. Dylan never learned it at all. But me, I learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's success so complete that your absence becomes their biggest regret. Every morning when I walk into Pacific Crown, past the reception desk where my photo hangs as division president, past the offices of people who followed me because they believed in what we were building, I think about that Friday afternoon when Harold told me I was being replaced by someone with fresh perspectives. He was right about one thing. Dylan did bring fresh perspective. He showed everyone exactly what happens when you value connections over competence, when you choose privilege over performance. What would you have done in my situation if you've ever been pushed aside for someone less qualified, overlooked for someone with better connections, or had your work stolen by someone who couldn't even understand it? I want to hear your story. Drop a comment below and let me know how you turned rejection into success. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button. It really helps other people find these stories of workplace justice. And if you want to hear more real stories about people who refuse to be victims of corporate politics, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to hear that their value isn't determined by other people's inability to see it. Sometimes the best thing that can happen is losing a job you were too good for anyway. Thank you for listening to my story. Remember, your expertise, your relationships, and your integrity, those are the keys nobody can take from you. Guard them well, value them properly, and never let anyone convince you that nepotism trumps merit. In the end, competence always wins. Until next time, keep building your irreplaceable value and remember, the best revenge is massive success.